The next witness will be Mr. Felix Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez, would you raise your hand? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth and the whole truth?
I do.
You may be seated. Questioning will begin by Mr. Barbadora.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Rodriguez. Good afternoon, Mr. Rodriguez. Your true name is Felix Rodriguez, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you have also been known by the name of Max Gomez, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Rodriguez, you are a citizen of the United States who was born in Cuba, correct?
That's correct.
And you came to the United States in 1954 to attend school, and in 1958 you moved here permanently, is that right?
That's correct.
From 1960 until 1976, you were involved with a number of operations associated with the Central Intelligence Agency. Could you give the committee an outline of the activities that you were involved in with the Central Intelligence Agency?
All right, sir. I came to school in 1954 in Pennsylvania, Procurement Preparatory School. In 1959, I temporarily separated from my schooling and went to the Dominican Republic to what it was a anti-communist legion at the time. After that, came back to the state, and in 1960 I finally graduated from high school. At the end of 1960, I joined the training camps, Central American country that we all know, where later the Bay of Pig invasion was launched from. I was trained there. I was trained in another Central American country. After that, we were, as you asked me to give a rundown on it,
what did you do after the Bay of Pigs invasion?
well, there was a group of about 80 people that they separated from the main force of the brigade, out of which they selected around 35 people. And we were infiltrated inside Cuba approximately 2 months before the invasion to participate in supporting the resistance inside the country and to wait for the Bay of Pig invasion, what later became the Bay of Pig invasion, to come in.
And after the invasion failed, you returned to the United States, is that right?
After the invasion failed, sir, I was in Havana, and they were putting in jail hundreds and thousands of people. I was lucky enough to be able to make it to the embassy of Venezuela in Havana. Spent 5.5 months in the embassy until I was able to leave with a safe conduct for Caracas, Venezuela. After 2 weeks in there, I was able to make it back to the state with a visa. And soon after that, since there was very little contact inside the island after the fiasco of the Bay of Pig, I was one of the few who maintained contact and continued to infiltrate the island several times in support of intelligence operation for the agency.
So you were sent to Cuba prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion, eventually came back to the United States after the invasion failed, and were sent back to Cuba on other occasions after the Bay of Pigs invasion, correct?
That's correct.
Later on, you were sent to Bolivia, were you not?
Well, that was 1967. Before that, 1963, I went to the U.S. Army as a second lieutenant on a special commission by President Kennedy. And I spent several months in the Army. At that time, I was requested to participate in a special operation approved by the President in Central America. And I joined special training camps in that point in time, also in Central America, in 2 different countries. And we run special operations against Castro. After that time, that terminated in 1965, I returned to the United States, continued to work with the agency at that time, did another few months sort of a TDY job in another Central American country, Venezuela. And after that, I returned and I was elected between 2 individuals. Among several individuals, I was one of the 2 that was elected to go to Bolivia to participate in the capture of what later became Che Guevara.
So you participated in the capture and interrogation of Che Guevara in Bolivia, is that right?
Yes, sir. I was the only foreigner who was able to talk to Commander Guevara for approximately 2 hours before he died.
After Bolivia, you went to Vietnam, is that right?
No, sir. After Bolivia, I went in 1968 to train a special intelligence unit in Ecuador. I spent several months in there, and afterward I was asked to be a special advisor to the Peruvian police anti-guerrilla unit. As a matter of fact, when I went there, I was not a paratrooper. It was a paratrooper unit. So I may tell this to you. When I first arrived, I was asked if I was a paratrooper, so I did my first jump without ever getting any training. I told them that I was a paratrooper and did jump 12 times with them, got my wing from them. And while I was there, the military coup of Velasco Alvarado took place. My unit was surrounded by the army. Eventually, they solved the problem, but they didn't or terminated all kind of U.S. aid in Peru at that time. And I returned to Miami. And I volunteered to go to Vietnam, which I did in 1970. I extended, and I went there in 1970, 71, and 72.
What did you do in Vietnam?
Well, sir, in Vietnam, I started advising a special group called the Provincial Reconnaissance Unit. During that time, I started very small to develop a helicopter concept that became very successful as time went by. I got recognition from the armed forces.
That helicopter concept was something that was used against insurgents, correct? Could you explain briefly what that helicopter concept was?
Yes, sir. It was very, very difficult to locate a very small guerrilla units in the area around Saigon. So the only thing that it occurred to me had to be an eyeball-to-eyeball contact with them. First of all, intelligence was very important. It was very accurate, provided by the agency. We'll then run a small, huge 500 helicopter at treetop level with a covering of 2 gunships and, of course, a good communication. And as soon as we had a eyeball-to-eyeball contact with the enemy that took some fire, we were able to mark them with color smoke grenade and getting immediate reaction from the gunships.
In Vietnam, did you work for a person named Don Gregg?
Yes, sir. Don Gregg was the regional chief in the area of around Bien Hoa, Saigon, what they call Region 3.
When did you retire from the CIA?
Well, after that, I did pull another tour of duty in South America and some other in the Caribbean area. And due to some back injury that I had sustained, I was recommended in 1975 that I should apply for a disability, which I did, and it took about a year to process, and I retired in 1976.
To get something out of the way right away, Mr. Rodriguez, is it fair to say that you have spent virtually your entire adult life fighting communist movements around the country, around the world, excuse me?
I have tried my best, sir. It's very hard to lose your country to communism. And the experience that we went through is something that sticks with you, and I want to take this time to tell you. When I was in Cuba and we felt left alone, we had nobody to turn to. And to me, it was it's the feeling that I see now in the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. I know their experience, because I was left inside once, and I wanted to help them as much as I could. And I expect that this would be understood by a lot of you, and it doesn't happen to them what happened to us.
You are also a strong supporter of the Contra cause, then, I take it?
Absolutely, sir.
Would you ever do anything to undermine the Contra cause?
No, sir.
Mr. Rodriguez, let me turn to 1983. At some point in 1983, you decided to go to Central America to assist a Central American country there with an insurgency movement that was operating in that country. Is that right?
1983, yes, sir.
What did you think you could do to help this country with its insurgency movement?
Well, sir, the scenario changed in different parts of the world, but I believe that my concept was going to be valid in any of those parts.
The helicopter concept that you used in Vietnam?
Absolutely, sir. So I went to different places. I visited those countries down there, and at that time, let me make very clear, it was not with any help from people in Washington. It was directly on my own with old friends that I had acquired in the past. But I was not had much of a luck in implementing the concept at that time.
Eventually, in 1985, you did go to this Central American country and start to implement your concept, is that right?
Yes, sir, I did.
Prior to going there, did you meet with some United States government officials?
Yes, sir, I did. I met with several of them. I visited Nestor Sanchez, the Undersecretary of Defense for Latin America. I also talked to Don Gregg, and through other means I did get to meet with officials of a Central American country that were in, I believe I could help with my concept.
What was Mr. Gregg's position at that time?
He was the assistant to the Vice President for National Security.
Did you also meet Colonel North before you went to Central America?
Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, I did. It was December 21st, 1984. I'd like to apologize that my first testimony wasn't that clear because I didn't recall much at that time. Right now, it's obvious, and everybody knows Colonel North is very popular. At that time, he was not very well known by many people. And I really thought that I was introduced to him by Don Gregg, but having a lunch the other day with a friend of mine from the State Department, he reminded me that on December 21st, 1984, while I was in his office and telling him that I was planning to visit Don at the White House, he suggested that I meet with Colonel Norris, who had the responsibility of the area in Central America where I was planning to go, and he believed that we have common ideals and he could be very helpful. So he called, which I later became to know, Fons, his secretary, and made the arrangements so that I could meet the colonel in his office after my meeting with Mr. Gregg.
And what happened with that, in that meeting with Colonel North?
I went over to see him after I finished my meeting with Mr. Gregg, and I carried an album that I had from my past experience, show him my capabilities in that field, expecting that he could help me. And also, I will turn to any help that I could anywhere to be able to go and try my concept in Central America.
Did he agree to support you in your efforts in trying to go to this Central American country?
In general term, I will say he was very positive about it.
Did you also meet with Vice President Bush prior to going to the Central American country?
Yes, sir. I asked Mr. Gregg that I had an interest of meeting the Vice President, so he arranged for me, I believe it was 29th of January, for a very brief meeting. It was not even
1985, is that
1985.
right?
It was not even recorded. It was just to go in and shake hands, and we spent a little longer time because, if I recall, there was a news program where they had the Vice President's family, and so we watched it together, and I showed him my album, and he was very interested in my life story.
Did you tell the Vice President that you intended to go to this Central American country to assist them with your helicopter concept?
Yes, I did, sir.
Did you have any discussion with the Vice President at that time about the Contras?
No, sir, no whatsoever.
How long did that meeting last?
Well, it took probably a little bit longer than we expected because he was actually watching the TV program with his family. So, but actually our conversation was specifically showing my album, even brought him an album that I have picture taken with Che Guevara and others, and I think it was very interesting for him, anybody to see it. And just after that we shook hands and I left.
When did you actually go to Central America?
Well, sir, I actually arrived in Central American country where I work and helped these people in exactly on the 15th of March, 1985.
And what did you do when you got there?
Well, when I got there, first of all, I had an introduction to the local people before I went there. And when I got there, it was sort of set up my shop in a place that a friend of mine provided for me, which is in the city. And there's a private individual which I know, and he's a local by nationality, not in the U.S. And I sort of very easily tried to start into providing my advice, which was very hard to do at the time, because very few people will understand, and anybody will go there and trying to implement a concept like that without requesting any money. I believe if I had requested a salary, it would have been much easier than what it was, because nobody will believe that somebody could do this for free.
You weren't being paid for what you were doing.
No, sir, I was not being paid. I was paid morally by my own feelings.
How were you supporting yourself while you were down there?
Well, my retirement will take care of my family. This friend of mine, who was a local individual, provided me with a place to stay, and I could sign the place where I was for food.
And did you begin to assist the government?
It was hard. The beginning was very hard. I had a big break in April 18 when we were able to capture a commandante alive. And that was my breaking point in introducing the concept and getting respect for the local people for the concept itself.
Between March of 1985 and September of 1985, how many missions did you engage in for this government?
Well, altogether, sir, it was over 100. I don't know exactly during that period. My helicopter was hit over 15 different times. I crashed once. I was able to fly back. My pilot was wounded in one of the operations.
Between March and September of 1985, did you do anything to support the Contras, or were your activities solely confined to assisting the government with the counterinsurgency operation?
It was mostly just strictly on that type of a field, the helicopter concept, and trying to get parts that was some kind of hard to get at times.
When did you first hear from Colonel North after arriving in Central America?
I think we met in several occasions, sir, during that period. At one point in time, he asked me that he wanted to talk to me. I think I was in Washington. I cannot recall the exact time, but it was before September of '85. We just, because of his schedule and mine, we couldn't get together, so he told me he was sending me a letter that will give me, his ideas what he wanted me to do.
And did you get a letter from Colonel North in September of 1985?
Yes, sir. I finally got it where I was down there on the 29th of September, and the letter was dated the 20th of September.
Mr. Rodriguez, could you take a look at Exhibit FIR 1?
Get my glasses.
And there should be a book of the exhibits in front of you.
What was the exhibit again, sir?
There should be, the exhibit should be in the book in front of you.
Yes, I got it.
That is a copy of the letter you received from Colonel North, correct?
That's correct, sir.
What did this letter ask you to do?
It was basically to request from the area where I was a location for maintenance of aircraft. I was told that where they were operating, it was very difficult to maintain their aircraft, and they didn't have any place with enough security to do it. And he felt that I had the respect of the people where I was, and I could be instrumental in asking them to see if they will support strictly for a space ramp to maintain this aircraft.
Let's go over this letter in a little more detail, Mr. Rodriguez. The letter notified you that the UNO FDN Air Arm was going to commence a resupply operation using a C-7 aircraft and a Caribou aircraft. Is that right?
Yeah, C-7 and the Caribou, the same thing, sir, yes.
I'm sorry, C-7 Caribou and a MAL aircraft. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what the letter asked you to do was to provide maintenance facilities at the air base in the country where you were working. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Basically, to get a space, I was told that there would be no need for any local maintenance. The group will have their own maintenance and clear people, clear personnel that will be able to maintain this aircraft.
So the FDN would provide the mechanics to work on the planes. All that Colonel North wanted was for you to gain the permission of the government to use the airbase as a place to work on the planes. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
Did this letter say anything to you about storing arms and ammunition on this airbase?
No, sir. Nothing whatsoever. Strictly in space.
What did you do after you got the letter?
Well, sir, I contacted the individuals that could help me in this. I explained to them the need for this type of operation, and I got the concurrence to go ahead with it. I think it was to the best interest to every single country in Central America.
And did you call Colonel North to tell him that you had gotten the permission of the authorities to use the
Yes, sir.
airbase?
I called him on the following day and told him that it was a go. And the only thing that I had to wait was, as the letter explained it, that somebody will contact me by the name of Mr. Green, and he will be the one who will help to implement and set up this shop down there.
And were you eventually contacted by someone who identified himself as working for Mr. Green?
Yes, sir, in the middle of December 1985 was.
Tell us about that contact. Was it by telephone?
Yes, sir, it was a telephone call, and the individual identified himself as Mr. Green. The voice sounded familiar, so I knew who he was.
Who was it?
Rafael Quintero.
And how did you know Rafael Quintero?
Well, sir, we were together back in the Bay of Pig invasion. We infiltrated in Cuba together at that time. As a matter of fact, after the failure of the invasion, one of my operations in reestablish the link inside Cuba, he was one of the people that I infiltrated inside Cuba at the time. We also worked together in the other program in Central America, 1963, 64, 65.
What did Mr. Quintero say to you in this conversation?
He explained to me that he was on behalf of Mr. Green, and that he will require, if I will get authority for a arrival on the following day of a Boeing 707, what he described was heavy stuff, which I understood to be military equipment.
You understood to be military equipment?
Yes, sir.
And did the 707 arrive the next day?
Yes, sir, it did.
What was it carrying?
Pardon?
What was the 707 carrying?
It was carrying military equipment, basically the thing that we got all along. It was, after that, it was 81 millimeter rounds. It was 60 millimeter rounds on AK-47 ammunition, some C4 explosive. It was somewhere around the 85,000 pounds load of equipment.
So the plane carried approximately 85,000 pounds of various types of ammunition.
That's right, sir.
Who owned this 707?
Well, he had the marking of Southern Air Transport.
And did you subsequently learn where these arms had come from?
Well, according to the manifest, that was not accurate because it said only 36 pounds on board. It was coming from Portugal.
What did you do with the ammunition?
We had to store it in a local warehouse.
You stored it at a warehouse on the air base, is that right?
That's correct.
Later on, did other 707s carrying ammunition arrive at the air base?
Yes, sir, I believe it did. Several came in on the following year.
And approximately how many airplanes came in loaded with ammunition?
I would say approximately between 5 and 6, the amount of about 500,000 pounds of equipment. That's what we had storage in the warehouse, give or take.
And approximately when did this ammunition, when was this ammunition delivered to the airport?
I believe it was some in March of 1986.
So between December 1985 and
I would
March
say
of
the
1986?
first part of 1986, most of them came in.
And all the ammunition was stored at this warehouse on the air base?
Yes, sir.
Did you also receive flights carrying non-lethal aid?
Yes, sir. There were some L-100 that came in with non-lethal aid.
And about when did those flights come in?
Let me check some of the notes that I have here, sir. Some came in 9th of February, and the first one came on January 17.
Mr. Rodriguez, could you pull the microphone a little bit closer?
All right.
Thank you, sir.
Sorry.
And how many flights came in carrying non-lethal aid?
Sir, you know, as I was telling you, it's not easy for me to recall because at the same time I was doing my flying, so it was on and off. If I give you an exact amount, it would not be very accurate, but...
Would it be of less than 10 flights?
Could be around less than 10, that's correct.
Where was the non-lethal aid stored?
Same place.
It was stored in the warehouse along with the ammunition?
That's correct.
The letter that you received from Colonel North in September referred to C-7 Caribou and Maul aircraft that would be arriving. Did a C-7 Caribou arrive at the air base at some point?
finally.
When was that?
Well, it didn't actually arrive. It actually had an emergency landing before it got there. It was in such a poor condition that he had to drop everything that was from the inside in the middle of the field and eventually make an emergency landing nearby our area. It was
Would it have been in February or March of 1986?
it was in February of 1986, sir.
And you mentioned there were some problems with the aircraft. Could you describe what those were?
Yes, sir. It lost one engine, and normally those aircraft were supposed to be able to fly with the other engine. It was in such a poor shape that it could not fly with one engine alone, even at sea level. After dropping everything from inside, it still would not fly, so it had to make emergency landing.
You say they had to drop things out of the plane. What did they drop out of the plane?
They dropped a spare part and a spare engine, and even the manuals, spare tires, and everything.
This was while they were flying to the air base in Central America?
Right. That's what they were trying to find a place to land for an emergency before they even got to the air base.
Did additional aircraft arrive at the air base?
Yes, then eventually one MAL arrived, and then one C-123.
Once the operation became fully operational, how many aircraft were there?
Well, we had altogether, I would say after June 25, we had altogether two C-123, we had two C-7 Caribou, and one MAL.
When did the operation actually start to make airdrops?
Well, there was a first airdrop, as I recall, that was made by the L-100, and it actually was made at night. First time they could not talk to they did talk to the people, but were not able to find them. On the second night, they were successful in finding them at nighttime and make a successful airdrop in the south front.
Would that have been in March of 1986?
Could be, sir. I'm not too good at dates in this. I didn't follow that closely.
Mr. Rodriguez, were there records made of what was taken out of the warehouse to be dropped to the Contra forces?
What was taken out of it?
Were there records kept of what was taken
Yes,
out of the
sir.
warehouse?
I made it available to this committee.
Will you take a look at FIR 2? And I just represent to you that FIR 3 is a translation of
Right.
FIR 2.
That's correct.
Are these the records of what was distributed from the warehouse between May and September, which you provided to the committee?
That's correct, sir, and I believe to be very accurate.
Mr. Rodriguez, the records that you provide showed that there were 9 resupply drops to the Southern Front forces between May and September, and 9 to the FDN forces in the north between May and September. Would you accept that as a fair estimate of the number of resupply drops that were made during that period?
I have no reason to believe otherwise.
They also show that the vast majority of the drops were made in September of 1986. Is that your recollection of when the drops were made?
That's correct, sir.
Why did it take until September for these drops to be made?
That was about the time that all the problems that the aircraft were having were able to be corrected in the meantime. Engines and communication equipment and navigational gears and all the problems they had in time through all of that months was finally taken care of and finally were in operational condition about that time.
What was your role in this air resupply operation?
Well, my role was, sir, to coordinate with the local authorities and this group and try to facilitate their entrance to the area, the clearance to take off and land, and logistical of the houses where all the U.S. personnel live.
Is it fair to say that you acted as a liaison with the host government?
That's fair, sir.
And without your connections with the host government, the operation wouldn't have been able to operate out of the air base, is that right?
Well, after it was established, I would assume that nobody's indispensable, that somebody else could have taken my role.
You also managed the fuel fund, correct?
Yes, sir. I make a point to keep a very clear records on that for my own responsibility with the local people, and you have been given a complete details of those funding that we manage, that it goes from every single gallon that went into every aircraft, the date when it was put in there, and the cost that we pay for it.
Colonel Dutton has testified that he was concerned about giving you money for the fuel fund. How did you manage to obtain control of this fuel fund, and why did you obtain control of the fuel fund?
Well, it was not a matter of gaining control of the fuel fund. It was a matter of establishing. It was established that way. And to facilitate the movement, we agreed that only 2 individuals had access to sign for the fuel. So they will bring the money in cash. We will deposit it with the local accountant. And we obtain a receipt for the exact amount that we have given them. And they maintain a precise record of every single gallon that we spend, and kept the balance. When it was getting low, we allowed those people to know in Washington and get some other funds to replace it.
And you have given those records to the committees, correct?
Complete, sir.
When you first got this letter from Colonel North in September, who did you think was going to be running this resupply operation?
I had no idea.
At some point in February of 1986, did you learn that Tom Kleins was connected with the operation?
It was a gradual process. Even when I talked to Mr. Quintero, he never told me who else was involved. I thought at the beginning that he was dealing directly with Colonel North. And then somebody who was in a neighboring country approached me and mentioned to me that they had received a boat. And that's where I got the figure that had been so widely publicized, that Mr. Klein was waiting for the boat, and he was able to receive the manifest. It could have been not during that time, but maybe before that. And this individual mentioned to me that in the manifest, the hand grenades that they were charging Mr. Calero over $9 were being bought in Switzerland for a little bit over $3, which make a tremendous profit of 200% over it. And that concerned me.
Who did you understand was selling the hand grenades to the Contras?
It wasn't that clear to me, sir. I just knew the fact that the boat had arrived, that Tom was waiting for it, and the price was tremendously high.
And when you say Tom, you mean Tom Kleins, is
Yes,
that
sir.
right? And it was your understanding that these hand grenades were being sold for $9 when they actually cost $3?
That's what I was told, sir.
How did you know Tom Kleins?
I knew Tom back in the 1961 when I came back from Venezuela. He was my case officer. I want to make clear to tell you that we were very close friends. I had a high regard for him at the time. It was unfortunate that because of the Wilson and Libyan situation in 1979, we completely broke with each other. And it was very hard for me because he did a lot for me in my career. But it got a point in time where perhaps principles and what I have fought so long became in conflict with Mr. Klein's attitude at the time. And from that time, we didn't have any fight or anything, but we just separated away from that time on.
So you knew Tom Kleins from your days working for the CIA, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you were a close friend of his.
Yes, sir.
And at some point you broke with Mr. Kleins, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And what was the reason for breaking with Mr. Kleins?
Well, sir, I knew about his involvement with Mr. Wilson at the time, and I had very little respect for Mr. Wilson and his connection with Gaddafi, which I consider an enemy of Cuba and an enemy of the United States. And at that point in time, we sort of separated, and I'd rather not speculate more about it.
And what was your reaction when you learned that Mr. Kleins was connected with this operation?
It was a big surprise because I know he was very close to Mr. Quintero, and why I would not have him tell me anything about it. So I found kind of funny that he was involved in that and never been told me of anything.
Were you concerned that Mr. Kleins was involved with the operation?
Yes, sir.
When did you learn that General Secord was running this operation?
Well, sir, it had to do with an incident of a mechanic that came to our area in...
That was in February of 1986,
right,
wasn't it?
That's correct.
Why don't you describe that incident?
I'll give you the exact date, because I don't forget that date. It was on the 5th of February of 1986. We have been told, I believe it was a phone call from Mr. Gadd to pick up this mechanic who was going to be working as our project the day before. Our people went to pick him up at the airport, and they actually could not identify the individual. It turned out to be that what they told me, because I never saw the individual, was that he was so old, it looked like he was walking to a nursery home after that. So, but that afternoon he called in to the house, and he was picked up by some of the people from the American cruise. On the following day, I had a call from Mr. Vernon Hugh, which I consider a professional and a friend of mine, and he asked me that he wanted to talk to me.
Who was Vernon Hughes?
Vernon Hughes was one of the rigger and kicker of the resupply operation.
He was one of the employees of the resupply operation.
Right.
Okay.
So he came to me and told me, he said, look, Max, we got a problem here. I say, why? I say, this guy came here, and the first evening he drank 24 beer. The second day he drank 36, and he said that he was told that this was a money-making operation. That he didn't like our house, that he wanted to move to a hotel. He mentioned that he had made $5,000 in Belize while fixing a plane that was going to do some contraband in Mexico, and that he himself had participated in fixing some airplanes in Puerto Rico that were Colombian, that had to do with drugs. I told Mr. Hughes not to tell him anything where he was or what was our operation about it, and to try to get him a ticket to leave immediately our area.
And did you call Colonel North to complain about this mechanic?
Yes, sir. I called on the 5th of that day, I called the colonel. Maybe that's why I'm security risk. I called him on the open telephone. We didn't have the equipment at the time. And I told him that that was not the agreement that he had told me about it. He told me that people were clear to coming down here, and I explained to him the incident that I just told you. Before I finished that, he said, wait, here's the man that you have to talk to. He's in charge of this. Here's Dick. He put Dick on the phone. And later I understood that Dick was General Secor.
Who told you that the Dick on the telephone was General Secord?
Well, I thought at the beginning it was Dick Gadd, but the voice didn't sound familiar. He was General have a very peculiar voice, very strong one. And he said, all right, I'll take care of that. I said, it's all right if I send him back tomorrow? He said, that's fine, do that. And that's what I did.
So you sent the mechanic back the next day?
Yes, sir. I don't think he ever knew where he was or what type of operation he was.
He spent 2 days in Central America and had 24 beers the first day and 36 the second,
That's
and
correct,
the next
sir.
day you sent him back, is that right?
And he didn't know why. We just said that we just didn't have any requirement at that time for him. We just came up and just sent him back.
Did you later meet with General Secord in Central America?
Yes, sir, I did.
When was that?
He came accompanying Colonel Norris in a meeting that took place in my area. And I think it was, I'm sorry about my memory on this, but I have to refer to my notes.
Let me remind you, it was on April 20th, 1986, wasn't it?
Okay, that's correct. Yes, on April 20, they came on a jet, a private jet, November 10, 12 Bravo, if I recall correctly. And there was supposed to be a meeting between them, Mr. Bermudez, and sort of a coordination type of deal.
Who was Mr. Bermudez?
He's the military chief of the FDN for the North Front.
What happened at that meeting?
Well, sir, the FDN were not very happy with the type of aircraft that were being provided. They thought they were too old. They thought that not only old, it didn't carry enough equipment. It was a tremendous risk to resupply a unit deep inside Nicaragua with those type of an aircraft. The payload that it will carry was very small, and the risk would be too great. He thought that they should have buy a better aircraft and a bigger and faster aircraft. He expressed that concern to Colonel Norris, and Colonel Norris told him that that those were donations, that he didn't control that, that if he had the money to buy, he probably would buy him a C-130, but since he didn't get money to buy, whoever donated him aircraft, that's what he would take and make it available to them. It was better than nothing. Also that they were going to have crews capable of flying this aircraft, and they will teach the FDN that it could be flown in there and it could be done safely, and they could serve the purpose.
When Mr. Bermudez complained to Colonel North about the condition of the aircraft, Colonel North response was that the aircraft had been donated and there was nothing he could do about the condition. Is that right?
That's correct, sir, and that's probably what I got my idea, that if it were donation, it does belong to the Nicaraguan freedom fighter.
Did Colonel North also say something about training FDN pilots to operate the aircraft?
Yes, sir.
What did he say?
He said about it that when they got sufficient confidence on this aircraft, then they maybe will be willing to go ahead and get their pilot, talking about the Nicaraguan pilot, trained so that they can continue with the mission.
Was there also a discussion at this meeting about end-user certificates for blowpipe missiles?
Yes, sir.
Tell us about that.
I was requested about 2-3 weeks before by Mr. Quintero that there was a need, which I recognize to be very valid, of some ground-to-air missile to provide to the Nicaraguans, since they had this new helicopter. And he said that they will require a local end-use certificate to acquire the blowpipes. That this unit were from a South American country whose company's name was Udall in Panama. It was Lay Resources in Panama. And to make the certificate in the name of Lay Resources, and that it was a South American country who owned this company and had the missiles.
Did you obtain the end-user certificates in the name of Lake Resources?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did you have a discussion with Colonel North at this meeting about the end-user certificates?
Yes, I asked him before I even asked for our friends to provide it, if it was all right to go ahead and produce this end-use certificate, and he told me yes. So I gave the end-use certificate to General Secor.
Did you ever learn whether the end-user certificates had been used?
No, sir. As a matter of fact, after a month and a half, or 2 months, I inquired from them what happened to the deal, and I was told that the deal was dead. They could not get any agreement with the South American country who had the unit. And knowing the importance of something like this, and I felt responsible for getting this certificate, I requested very strongly that it be returned to the country, several times.
Were the end-user certificates returned?
No, sir. It's never returned.
Do you know what happened to them?
No, sir.
Mr. Rodriguez, at some point that spring, did you make a decision to leave the resupply operation and your involvement with the country in Central America?
2 days after that trip, sir.
What was the reason for your decision to leave?
Well, it was a very personal reason. I don't know if I got a sick feelings or something, but after I saw the people in there, I didn't feel comfortable with it, and I thought I would better leave.
You didn't trust the people that were running this operation, is that right?
Basically, sir.
You didn't trust General Secord, and you didn't trust Tom Kleins, is that right?
For this type of operation, with that much money, no, sir.
Why didn't you trust them?
I think it's it's hard for me to answer that, sir. It was just a feeling. I just didn't want any part of the operation anymore at that point.
Well, let me suggest something to you. Could it have been that you were concerned that in prior activities that General Secord and Tom Kleins had been involved in profiteering, and you were concerned that they might be involved in profiteering in this case as well?
You said it. Could be.
Well, what's your answer?
I don't have any specific. I just had a feeling, sir. I just wanted to leave at that time. I like to speak when I have proof, and if I don't, I think it's for somebody else to determine in a court of law.
Let's see if we can leave it this way. Is it fair to say that you were concerned about the people that were running this operation?
Yes, sir.
There has been considerable testimony about communication security devices called KL-43s. Did you ever have a KL-43?
Yes, sir. I had a KL-43, and I altogether sent over 77 messages, which I gave copy to you of all of them.
Who did you communicate with using the KL-43?
I checked the record again. It was all the time with Mr. Quintero, with Mr. Dutton, and I believe there was one message to Mr. Cooper that was used in the machine that I have from somebody else in Miami. But the rest of the 76 messages were between myself and Quintero and myself and Mr. Dutton.
Did you ever use the KL-43 to communicate with Colonel North?
No, sir. Never did.
Let me go back to your decision to leave in May, and let me ask you, at around the same time, did you have an appointment to meet with Vice President Bush?
Yes, sir.
When did that meeting take place?
The meeting actually took place on the 1st of May of 1986.
Prior to the meeting, did you meet with Colonel North?
It was after the meeting that I had with Colonel North.
Who was at the meeting with Vice President Bush?
Well, if you want me to go a little bit backwards, when I decided to leave, I communicated to my local friend in the area that I was planning to leave. I would not give him any reason. I just told him that I was tired, that I had been for over a year flying there. I have been separated from my family too long, and I was going to leave for a while. He asked me why. He was concerned that he believed that I was very useful in the area, and he wanted to know what I was leaving. And it didn't make much sense to him that I have taken the decision right after that trip. I told him that I will return, and then explained to him after I make my final decision. I requested that day to meet with the ambassador of that place, which was a friend of mine. I want to make sure that everybody knows that I did not discuss with him anything on the military aspect of this. We were in a meeting before where humanitarian aid was considered, and he was there and I was there. I didn't tell the ambassador either my principal motive for leaving. I just told him that I was planning to leave, that I was tired, that I would also feel bad about, I put it like, begging for airline tickets for my friends to be able to commute back and forth to Central America. He told me that I was doing a magnificent job on the helicopter concept. He'll hate to see me leave, but anyway, he took my address and telephone number. He liked to keep as a friend and keep in touch.
Let's then move ahead to May 1st, and I want to ask you again, didn't you meet with Colonel North before meeting with the Vice President?
Yes, sir. I made a point during that meeting to go a little earlier to the White House. I went to the third floor to Colonel North's office. I didn't give him any reason, basically the same reason that I gave my other friend. I told him, I said, look, Colonel, I am tired. I have been well over a year now down there, and I can arrange for anybody else to continue with this type of operation, but I am leaving.
What was Colonel North's reaction when you told him you were leaving?
He told me that it was very important to state that all soldiers get tired, to take 2 weeks vacation if I wanted, but he didn't want me to leave. And I told him I was still leaving. I was still planning to leave.
What happened then?
Well, I left his office. I came downstairs to the office of Mr. Gregg, and we jointly went to visit the Vice President. I had carried with me an album of my operations in Central American country where I was, which shows my helicopter operation. It shows even when I crashed in the helicopter while we recovered, and a whole sequence of that. I briefed the Vice President.
Who else was at the meeting besides you and Mr. Gregg?
It was Sam Watson, and was also Nick Brady, senator, I believe, who was in the Kissinger Commission, and the Vice President said that he thought it was interesting to Mr. Brady to stay, since he was in the Kissinger Commission interested in Central American affairs.
How long did the meeting last?
It could have lasted anywhere between 15 minutes and 25 minutes, because it took a little time while I was showing him the album. And I went by to explain to him when I started the problem that I had with the operation in the area where I was, all the problem that I went through to finally get the operation established, the successes that we had, and also explained to him the report that we had that the guerrilla in the area had reduced tremendously from 11 to 12,000 when I was there until less than 4,000 at that point in time.
What operation are you referring to?
Helicopter operation.
So you told the Vice President about what you were doing in conjunction with the government of that Central American country in dealing with the insurgents, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And
I showed him the album that had to do with my operation there. I want to make clear that at no point in any of these conversations I ever mentioned to him anything that will remotely be connected to the Nicaraguan or the Contras.
You anticipated my next question, Mr. Rodriguez.
I knew you were coming to that.
Let's be sure we're clear on that. Did you say anything to Vice President Bush about your activities on behalf of this resupply operation?
No, sir, not to him or anyone on his staff.
Did you say anything to Vice President Bush about what Colonel North was doing in connection with the resupply effort?
No, sir, not at all.
Why didn't you discuss this with Vice President Bush?
I didn't see a reason why to discuss it. When I went to the area that I went was for something completely different, and now this has become a big issue. At the time, it was just it wasn't of that importance, and I didn't feel that it was my duty to tell him, or anybody else, for that matter.
Did you tell Vice President Bush of your decision to leave the Central American country?
I was planning to, sir.
What happened?
Well, when we went into the meeting, and I was showing him the picture from my helicopter concept, an aide came in and said that the ambassador to the area where I was wanted to talk to him briefly. The Vice President, as I recall correctly, said he didn't have time, he had somebody else, another appointment, and his aide insisted that it would take only a few seconds. So at that point in time, the Vice President agreed, and the ambassador to the country that I was came in with Colonel Norris. Colonel Norris did stay in the background, and the ambassador came in and shook hands with all of us, and he told the Vice President that I had done a magnificent job in his area, and that he wanted that as long as he was ambassador there, I would stay. I'm sure the Vice President knows what he was talking about because I haven't made my pitch that I was leaving yet.
So at that point, you decided to stay?
It was kind of hard, and I think everybody got flattered when it's not every day an ambassador goes there and asks the Vice President for somebody to stay in a country. So I think that I made that decision.
So out of embarrassment about telling the Vice President you were going to leave, you decided to stay and you returned to Central
I
America?
didn't even mention anything from there on.
Did you meet with the Vice President again later in May?
Yes, we knew there was going to be a celebration that takes place in Miami on Cuban Independence Day on the 20th of May. So I did visit that place with a local officer friend of mine. And we met with the Vice President very, very briefly. I was in a room with about 40 different people, and he came in and shook hands with us, and I asked him if he would take a picture with my friend's wife and with him, which he did gladly, and he introduced us to his son, Jeb, and that was about the extent of it.
Did you say anything at this meeting with the Vice President about what you were doing
No, sir.
in connection with the resupply effort?
Not at all.
Have you ever had any other meetings with the Vice President?
No, sir. That's all the 3 meetings that we ever had. If you can consider this, I mean, it was very, very short.
Colonel Dutton has described a meeting which he and you attended in Colonel North's office in June of 1986. Do you remember that meeting?
Yes, sir.
What was the purpose of that meeting?
Well, when I was called over the telephone by Mr. Quintero, actually what I was told over the telephone that they were considering making me a manager for the area. I have no idea one way or the other. And they wanted me to go to talk to them in Washington. And later on that day, Mr. Dutton called and he asked me if I could be in Washington by the 25th of June.
And did you go to Washington on the 25th of June?
Yes, sir. I flew into the Washington area on the 24th. I stayed in a hotel. He called me that night. Then he informed me later on that we were going to have a meeting at the White House at Colonel Norris' office at noontime.
What happened at the meeting?
Well, let me tell you, when I got in, I was thinking Mr. Roman 1 and 2 punch, and it was something a little bit similar here, probably for me to soften my position with these people. First of all, we got into the gate of the White House, and Mr. Dutton was clear, and I was not. I don't know if it was purposely or not. At the same time, I had requested on my own a meeting, not a meeting, but the access to one of the secretary at the Vice President's office to be able to pick up the photograph of my friend's wife with the Vice President. She had been asking for it, and of course, since they don't know anybody, people like that, they asked me to come up and pick up in a book that they have the picture of the two of them so that the Vice President will sign it for them. So I asked them to, I called the office, and as I understand, the Vice President was out of the country, and so was done. And one of the secretaries there, Medley, I believe, was going to take me at 1:30 to pick up this picture. So we got in before time. We got in at 12 o'clock because I had this other meeting with the colonel, and I wasn't in, so I called in and finally got myself clear. And we finally got into the office of Colonel North, which is a different office at this time of 2 levels.
When you got into the meeting with Colonel North and Mr. Dutton, did you discuss this proposed reorganization plan?
He showed me the paper of the reorganization. We had more block than people that we had, but it looks pretty impressive in paper.
What was your role to be in this reorganized operation?
I was the liaison between them and the host government.
What was your reaction when you were shown the reorganization plan?
I smiled. I just give it back to him, the papers.
Did Colonel North also talk to you about a communication security problem at that meeting?
Yes, sir. The colonel started by saying that Bob here, referring to Mr. Dutton, want you, or his people down there said you have been very helpful with them, and they want you to be part of this organization. But I am not sure because, you know, I have been told that you are a security risk, that you speak openly over the telephone, over a radio that you have. And I have to admit that I was mad. I'll be very polite here, but my words to him were not that polite. I told him that he thought I was a security risk. He could, in a stronger word, keep his operation, that I would have nothing to do with it. He told me that I had to understand that it was a matter of record that I have been a security risk. And I say, well, prove it to me. Show me any paper that said that I have compromised any operation in this process. The colonel told me that because of the Freedom of Information Act or whatever, I don't recall exactly what he said, that he could not show it to me. I say, well, I'll give you an authority in paper. I'll sign for you any paper you want so that the CIA, the FBI, the NSC will release any of my telephone conversation to you or to the press or to the world, but prove to me that I am a security risk. He lowered his face, he took some note, and he didn't mention that again. Then he asked, he wanted me to accept that job and receive a compensation of $3,000 a month.
Did you agree to work for $3,000 a month?
No, sir. I told him that I had a retirement, that I would help him the same. Then he asked me, well, you don't want to be part of the organization? I say, it's not a matter of being a part of the organization or not. I have helped you all the way along, and I didn't need that. He told me to, well, think about your family. It was kind of ironic because in a year and a half that I have been flying down there, nobody would worry about my family.
Mr. Rodriguez, did you also complain to Colonel North about the condition of the aircraft that were being used in the resupply operation?
Yes, sir, I did.
What did you tell him?
Well, we explained to him the poor condition of the aircraft. I brought up with me a concern that was written by one of the pilots, and it was right after one of their aircraft almost crashed. It had such a poor equipment that it was about 10 miles off south where it was flying at nighttime, and it hit the top of a mountain. It destroyed the left jet engine. We took pieces of wood about this side from inside the engine, and this crew wrote a letter of complaint to them the following day. I got a hold of a copy and I brought it up with me. I gave it to the colonel, and the colonel started reading this letter, and he looked at Mr. Dutton and looked at me and said, is this a joke? And I said, I don't believe it's a joke, and the people who wrote it almost get killed the day before they wrote that. So he looked at Dutton and said, do you know about this letter? And Dutton said, oh yes, but I didn't thought it was important to bring it to your attention. So the colonel said, well, you know, a letter like this, if it goes to the press, will do a lot of harm. He said, well, Mr. Dutton answered, don't worry about it. He's now our chief maintenance officer for the whole program, and we have increased his salary tremendously starting next month.
Mr. Rodriguez, take a look at Exhibit FIR 4. Is that the letter that you showed to Colonel North?
Yes, sir, that's the letter.
Who wrote that letter?
Mr. Payawati.
And who was he?
He's one of the pilots that was in the operation. A retired colonel, if I recall, lieutenant colonel.
What was wrong with these aircraft?
They were very old. The communication equipment were very old. The radars were very old and will not, well, you have all the, in the letter explaining all the anomalies and all the problems that they had. You can read some of it if you wish, of what his complaint was.
Well, did the planes have inadequate radar?
According to all that he wrote here, he didn't have anything adequate.
To your knowledge, did the planes have any equipment to detect radar?
Well, I saw one when I came by that I brought back. It was a small radar detector, I will imagine was to detect the radar system inside Nicaragua. It could not be that expensive because it was a Fox XX made by Radio Shack.
It was a radar detector used for cars, is that right?
In this case, it was being used by airplanes.
And they were using a radar detector for cars to detect radar in the airplanes.
Yes, sir.
Were there other problems with the aircraft?
Ask me if there is anything right with it, and I might be able to answer it. Most of them, there's a lot of
Well, is it
problems.
fair to say that the aircraft were frequently broken down?
They were frequently flying, not too much. Most of the time, they were broken down, sir.
They were broken down more often than they were working, isn't that
Yes, sir.
right?
They were very old, and it was hard to maintain.
And in your opinion, did these aircraft, because of their poor condition, pose a safety risk for the people flying them?
Absolutely, sir.
In fact, one of the aircraft hit the top of a mountain, and that's what prompted this letter to be written, isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
What was Colonel North's reaction when you showed him this letter?
Well, I just explained it to you, the reaction that he took to, he looked at Dutton, and
Could you repeat it, please?
he looked at Mr. Dutton and said, well, first of all, he looked at me and said, is this a joke? And I say, no, I don't think it's a joke. When the people who wrote it almost get killed the day before. Then he looked to Mr. Dutton and said, do you know about this? And Dutton said, yes, but I didn't thought it was important to bring it to your attention. So he said, a situation like this, if the press get a hold of, will bring a lot of problems to us. So Mr. Dutton answered, well, you don't have to worry about it. He's now our chief maintenance pilot, and his salary has been increased starting next month.
So Mr. Dutton's reaction was to promote the person complaining rather than to improve the
Well,
aircraft.
apparently he had taken that decision before this, the way it sounded to me.
After discussing the condition of the aircraft with Mr. Dutton present, did you ask to speak to Colonel North alone?
Yes, sir, I did.
What did you say to Colonel North when you spoke to him alone?
I was very concerned with the whole thing, and I asked if I could talk to him briefly alone. And I looked straight at him and said, Colonel, it's pretty hard for me to go over this here. I said,
I'd like you to
"Colonel,"
repeat what you told him, please.
I said, Colonel, I have learned that there are people stealing here. I had to understand that there are hand grenades bought at $9 a piece, bought at $3 a piece and sold at $9 a piece. And if this is known and the people which are involved connected to the Wilson case before is going to be worse than Watergate, and this could destroy the President of the United States. He told me that that was not the case, that Mr. Klein was a patriot, that Mr. Klein was not buying any equipment from anybody, that he was just helping him in the transportation of the equipment. So at that point, I told him that I was going to leave. I had to go down to pick up some pictures, and I left the room.
And was that your last meeting with Colonel North?
Yes, sir.
At some point before the end of the meeting, Colonel North also made a reference to Congress, did he not?
Yes, sir. That was the day, if I recall, when you all had the voting on the aid to the Contras. And what I've learned through this, listening to all of the testimony here, he's kind to go into the dramatic side. So he went looking to the TV where the hearings were taking place, or the voting was taking
A
place.
congressional debate was going on and it was being shown
Right.
on TV, right?
And he looked at the TV and said, those people want me, but they cannot touch me because the old man loved my ass. I'm sorry, but he told me to say it that way.
Mr. Rodriguez, after you left that meeting with Colonel North, you went to the Vice President's office, correct?
Yes, sir, I went on my own, not escorted by...
You didn't
Mr.
go
Dutton.
with Colonel Dutton?
No, sir.
And you picked up the picture at the Vice President's office?
Well, when I came into the Vice President's office, I knew that Mr. Gregg and the Vice President were out of town. I believe they were out of the country at the time. And I ran into Mr. Watson. So I got together with him in Don's office, and we started discussing some problem that we had in getting helicopter were approved for 1985 for the area where I was, and the spare part that we badly needed for those helicopters. So we spent some time talking about that. When Colonel Norris came in with Mr. Dutton, we stopped the conversation, and Mr. Dutton waited outside in the room. And then very short after that, I went with Madeleine, who came to the other room to pick up the pictures and show her the picture that I needed for my friend down there and his wife. Then we left together.
Did you tell Mr. Watson anything about what you were doing with the resupply effort, or your dissatisfaction with the resupply effort?
No, sir. We were discussing the helicopter program.
After that meeting, did you return to Central America?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Rodriguez, at some point in late July or early August of 1986, you were accused by Mr. Quintero of stealing one of the resupply aircraft. Could you describe that incident for us?
Well, sir, I was in my place in Central America when a general friend of mine from another South American country, way out, far from Central America, was visiting us in Miami, and I saw the opportunity to visit with him in my house, and there was a friend of mine who was flying a private plane back to Miami, and I did. And I was told that one of the C-123 was just about ready to be finished, a repair that they were conducting on the aircraft, and it should be returning back to the area in Central America. So I decided it would be a good ride to go in with my friend and returning that aircraft. It didn't cost me anything. Spent a few days with my friend. So on the weekend, I expressed to Mr. Quintero that I was planning to take this aircraft and go back when it was ready. The aircraft was loaded with spare part that we badly needed for the other aircraft down there. He told me that we should hold on it because he was waiting for some medicine. It was mountain leprosy that was badly needed in that area. My understanding from the past was that what we were waiting for was a big box of medicine. And I thought it was uneconomical to keep a C-123 for a box of medicine. It could be sent commercially. When I explained that to him, he told me that no, that it was a half plane full of medicine that was needed down there. So I consulted with Mr. Jim Stevenson from Southern Air, explained what I have been told, and asked him if he will consult with Mr. Lanton, and because I think it needed to go back there. We had a whole bunch also of IV that were donated. That's at no cost to anybody, that I got from a friend of mine for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. And it was already loaded in the plane. It was about 1,500 pounds worth of IV. I was afraid if it stayed longer in the heat, it will go bad. So he checked with Mr. Lanton. He said that they had enough material in there to fill a C-130, that if this load of medicine would arrive, that they could always charter a C-130 from Southern Air. It would be considerably more cheaper than to fly the 123 back and forth. So then I said, okay, then we'll go on, I believe it was a Monday. So we boarded that aircraft the way it was, and we flew to the Central American country, and it takes 7 hours to get there in that thing.
When you got to Central America, did you get a call from Rafael Quintero?
Well, first of all, it was like a joke. A friend of mine was waiting for me, and he looked at me and said, "Max, guess what?" I said, "What?" He said, "You have a stolen aircraft." I said, "You're kidding." We thought that either hijack or a stolen aircraft. So we joked about it, and he said that he got instruction from Mr. Quintero. I will imagine, I'm sure it was from Quintero higher, not from him, to refuel the aircraft and send it back just the way it was to Miami, with all the spare part and everything on board. So I went to, I thought it was ridiculous because whatever was on that aircraft was strictly a spare part for the plane that were badly needed to put them in a shape to continue the operation down there. So I told them to go ahead and unload the aircraft on my responsibility.
And then did you get a call from Mr. Quintero?
We went to the house for dinner that evening, and Mr. Quintero called, and he asked my friend if the plane arrived, he was ready to return. He was told that no, that it was unloaded. I said, who did it? He said, well, Max. I said, all right, can I talk to him? So he got on the telephone, he told me in Spanish, he said, well, are you with me or against me? So I told him, I say, Rafael, I don't think this is a situation of being for or against anybody. I think this is equipment which is needed here for spare part for this aircraft, unless this operation is finished and terminated. And he told me that's precisely what's happening. He said, we have terminated the operation. I should be back in your area in the next 3 days to close down all the houses and tell the pilots on behalf of their principal that if they do fly on those aircraft, it will be under their responsibility, that there will be no salaries for them, that there will be no compensation, no security, there will be no money for the houses, and there will be no fuel account, no money for the fuel. This thing is finished.
What did you do after being told that the operation was being closed down?
I was very concerned, sir, because even though the aid had already been approved by Congress, I know it will take a while before they could take over the support of these people inside Nicaragua. And I felt very strongly about it. I was abandoned once inside my country, and I felt it would be a disaster if these people are abandoned at this time like that. So I went to Mr. Hughes, a friend of mine, asking if he could get for me a crew that will fly for free. That I knew him and how he felt about the operation, and he told me that he will check. He came back to me and he said that he will fly for free, that Mr. Cooney, one of the other pilots, will do it, and also Bob Sawyer, which I have a great respect of him, and we die in the C-123 over Nicaragua.
So the pilots agreed to fly for free, correct?
Those 3 pilots agreed there was a crew for C-7 to continue to fly. So what we needed was the fuel, so I went to see a local friend of mine. I explained to him the situation that we had, and my strong feeling that these people could not be abandoned, and he felt the same way. It was to the best interest to his country as to ours that the Nicaraguan freedom fight will prevail. So Mr. Hughes told me that he felt very strongly that if I talked to the rest of the crew, that they were not mercenaries, that they were people that needed money to live on, but that they will most probably continue to fly for free, for what they believe. So I asked them to set up a meeting with all of them in House C that we call, and we gathered up the American members of the crew in that house.
Around the same time you received a call from Don Gregg, correct?
I think it was probably after I had that meeting in the house.
Within a day or two after the meeting, though. And in that call, Don Gregg said to you that he had heard from Ollie North that there was a problem with the aircraft. Isn't that right?
Yes, the way it sounded to me, I didn't know. I believe that he didn't know exactly what the situation was. He called me and said, Felix, do you have any idea of a plane that have been stolen and a pending suit? Of course, I already have heard from a local in the area that I was that somebody was putting a suit. I don't know if it was for $500,000 on behalf of the owners of the aircraft. It was supposed to be a Panamanian company for stealing the aircraft. And he was, I guess, using Don and his influence and my friendship to get him to use me to release the aircraft.
Colonel North was using your friendship with Don Gregg to get him to get you to release the aircraft. Is that
Yes,
right?
sir.
And you told Don Gregg in that conversation that you wanted to come up and see him in Washington, didn't
No, I
you?
told him first, okay, Don. Then I sat and thought about it, and I said, well, I didn't want to talk to him about this operation like I never did before, but I thought it was legal now, that the Congress had approved the aid to the Nicaraguan freedom fighter at that time. And I decided then that it was time for me to go and talk to him and explain what had been going on, especially since the agency was in the process of taking over this operation.
And that meeting with Mr. Gregg occurred in Washington on August 8th, didn't it?
That's correct, sir.
Who else was at that meeting?
At that meeting, I believe, if he didn't arrive, he was not there, but arrived a little later, Mr. Watson, Colonel Watson.
And in that meeting, you told Don Gregg that Ollie North was connected with what you referred to as the Wilson Group in running this resupply operation, didn't you?
Yes, sir. At that meeting, I think I started by telling Don, Don, I'm sorry, I thought I never had to come to you with this, but I think it's about time that I put it up to you what is going on right now. And I went on to explain to him my concern about the situation and my concern that of what might happen if they continue with the operation.
Exactly what did you tell him?
Well, I told him that I was very disturbed with the situation that had arose down there. I explained to him at that time that there have been an operation to support a Nicaraguan freedom fighter from where I was. I don't recall in detail if I gave him whether I was involved or not. I'm sure that I knew about it. And I explained to him that I had a report from somebody that Tom Klein had been involved in purchasing equipment for them, and explained to him the incident of the hand grenade that I was told. Also another incident that I learned that, for example, Mr. Guile was using a couple of people in the wrong way in the country south, that I don't know how you refer, what number you refer to, and that their salary was $100 a day for one, $100.50 the other one. And I was told that Mr. Dutton had found out that he was actually charging $400 a day for one and $450 a day for the other one. He was making $600 a day on those people in a period of 6 months that would have amounted to $100,000. And you can do quite a bit with $100,000 in support to these people.
Did you tell him that Richard Secord was involved in the operation?
Yes, sir.
Did you tell him Tom Kleins was involved in the
Yes,
operation?
sir. I was concerned that even if they had done nothing wrong in this, the reputation that they had, the Peter Mash book and everything, it would be a disaster if it was known by everybody and the press.
It would be a disaster because Ollie North was involved with this group, isn't that right?
Right. Ollie North representing the administration, and these people were involved in this other deal before.
What was Don Gregg's reaction when you told him that this group of people was involved with Ollie North in this resupply operation?
He was pretty surprised. He was pretty mad, if I recall, and even though I told him I didn't want to make a big wave on it, but he immediately got on the telephone and he called upstairs to Colonel North's office. He was not there, so he spoke to Earl and told him that he had heard outrageous report from my friend Felix, the way he put it, and he wanted him to come down to listen for himself. And if he had known that people like Tom Klein were being used, he was outrageous. You know, he knew who he was and give some qualificative about him. Not very nice one.
Was the matter resolved at this meeting?
Well, sir, I left after that. I went back to my country in Central America. He thanks me for telling him he was not aware, and I think he saw also the same potential problem that I did. I subsequently learned that he took this matter up with a group of people, including a State Department agency, and raised my concern to them.
Was the matter eventually worked out with the owners of the aircraft so that the resupply operation resumed?
Well, I think the resumption of the aircraft have really not much to do with this, as I will explain. My understanding was at that point that they were really to close the operation down there. I went to see my friend and asked him down in the area where I was if he could provide fuel to continue the operation for these people, like going back to the meeting that I didn't finish. We got together all the members of the crew in House C, like we call, and I explained to him exactly what I have been told by Mr. Quintero. I'm sure he was acting on behalf of General Secor, I will imagine, and told them that as what I was told is that the operation was terminated, that they had the blessing of nobody from there on, that if they touch any of those aircraft was on their own. There would be no salaries involved for them. There would be no compensation and no fuel account. I explained to them that I have lost my country to communism, that I did not believe that they were mercenaries. A lot of them had to receive money to live on, but I was pretty sure that they will do it because they believe in the cause. And all of them agreed to continue the operation with no pay.
In any event, you did reach an agreement with the owners of the aircraft to resume the resupply missions, didn't you?
I did not, sir. I didn't actually make an agreement.
Did the resupply operations resume?
What I can understand afterward, when they probably heard that they had not much of a control to pull those assets out where they was, as I understand, they sent a cable down saying, and I have here at this place, they sent a cable down saying that they have reconsidered, they have talked to the owners of the aircraft and explained to them that there was more requirements than expected, and they had agreed to continue the operation, but make it very clear that those aircraft did not belong to the Nicaraguan Freedom Fighter. That was a private proprietor who owned them. And as soon as the operation was finished, the aircraft would be taken away by them.
And at that point, did the resupply missions resume?
Yes, sir.
The missions were different in one respect, though, weren't they? That is that from every mission after that point, an FDN soldier was placed on the aircraft with an AK-47 to make sure the aircraft weren't stolen. Is that right?
Yes, sir. We put an air guard, you want to call it that. It was a young Nicaraguan, about 17-year-old, to make sure that those planes were not taken from the route they're supposed to. And he was one of the guys who died in that crash.
Where were you when the Hassenfuss crash occurred?
I was in Miami, sir.
And how did you get notice of the crash?
I got a call from my friend in Central America, and he told me that the aircraft was overdue in time in returning to the base. I asked him to check in all possibilities where he could have landed in neighboring countries, and none gave any positive result, and we knew exactly how much fuel he had. So we had to assume it was down somewhere. So I asked him if he could try to arrange a search, but it was most likely that it was probably in enemy territory.
Did you let anybody in the United States government know that the plane was missing?
Yes, sir. I believe this was the beginning of a big problem, and I was not really at that time in talking terms with the colonel. So I decided to call Colonel Watson. I guess it was his home, and I told him that one aircraft was missing that was being working in our area down there, and then on the following day, after I got confirmation by the Cuban radio that it was down, they had a prisoner, I also called him and told him about it. And
after notifying Colonel Watson of the fact that the airplane was missing, did you have any further involvement with the resupply operation after that?
No, sir.
Mr. Chairman, that completes my questions.
Mr. Ballin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Rodriguez.
Good afternoon, sir.
Mr. Rodriguez, I just have a few questions about the facts behind some of your concerns in terms of the people running this resupply operation. I believe you testified that you had heard about the price of grenades being charged 3 times. The charge should have been $3, and they were charging $9. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
And that they were selling those to the FDN at the inflated price of $9 rather than the true price of $3?
I have the understanding, sir, that you could ask him that Mr. Calero have seen the original list that was taken from that boat that shows that it were bought at $3 a piece or $3.50 a piece, and that he had paid $9.50.
When was the sale of these grenades
I
made?
have no idea. It could have been '84, but all that matters because I had no idea. I just knew the fact that this boat arrived in this neighboring country with this cargo, and I have no recollection or any news when it happened.
Your testimony is it could have been in '84,
Could be any
85,
anytime, '84, '85, '86.
'86. Do you know whether these grenades were the same grenades that were being stored at the warehouse in the
I
country
have
where
no
you...
idea, sir. I never saw them because they were in a different country.
And my other question on the grenade, was this to your own personal knowledge that you knew about the price of the grenade, or was this what someone told you?
It was somebody who told me that had picked up the manifest on behalf of the neighboring country government,
And
who knew apparently the prices that Mr. Calero was paying for it.
And if I were to tell you that Mr. Calero testified that he stopped purchasing arms over the summer of 1985, would that help you place the date of when this grenade shipment could have been
It
made?
could have been before because I really was never told when would that took place.
This is not something you're testifying to your own personal knowledge. This is just something you heard from another person.
Absolutely.
Now, my other question that I wanted to ask you concerned your other concern about the resupply operation and how it was being conducted, and I just wanted to inquire into your basis for that. You had heard...
If I may interrupt you for just a moment, I'm informed that the Senate has a vote, and so the senators will be leaving very shortly. And I will indicate what the schedule is tomorrow and for the balance of the afternoon. We'd like to complete the questioning by council this afternoon. I understand Mr. Balin has only a few questions and Mr. Leon has a few also. At the end of that, we will complete this day's session. Tomorrow we will begin with the questioning of Mr. Rodriguez by the principal questioners, Senators Mitchell and Tribble and Representatives McCollum and Jenkins. And of course other members will have an opportunity to ask questions if they like under the 5-minute rule. Then we will go to an executive session, not in this room, and of course the public will not be permitted or the media will not be permitted for the examination of another witness. In the afternoon, we will have Ambassador Tams at 2 o'clock. So that's roughly what's ahead of us here for the next day or so. Yes. The morning session will begin at 9:30. Mr. Balin, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rodriguez, I just wanted to inquire briefly into your other area of concern in terms of overcharging and try to establish the basis of your knowledge on that. You had heard that the people working in another southern neighboring country were being paid a salary of about $100, $150 a day, and in fact, Mr. Gadd was charging more for those people.
That's what I heard, sir.
Yes. Did you know that to your own knowledge?
No, sir.
Let me ask you this. You also testified, if I understand your testimony correctly, that you learned of that fact after it had been corrected by Mr. Dutton, after those charges were no longer being incurred?
Well, the correction was that he fired the 2 individuals that were hired down there because they were making too much money.
Okay, very good, sir. Did you have any other, apart from the grenades that you mentioned and this one instance with the salaries of the individuals, did you have any other first-hand information of overcharging or price gouging in the resupply operation?
No, sir, and I want to clarify, for example, that when he was told that all the pieces were tested down there, the only piece that was tested was the 81-millimeter round, because the boxes said that they were made in 1954. So that was the only item that was tested, and the 821 submachines were tested not because it looks old, but because they didn't know, the people from the FDN didn't know whether the belt ammunition was the proper one or not for it, and it did fire fine. Those were the only 2 items that were tested.
Just to clarify one other point in your testimony, and then I have no further questions, Mr. Rodriguez. There came a time you testified as to the problems that you were aware of with the aircraft. Of course, your primary responsibility was your helicopter operation that you were conducting. In terms of the aircraft, I believe your testimony is correct, and I don't want to misstate it, but there came a time when the aircraft were operational and fixed, and that was around September when the missions increased.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rodriguez.
Mr. Leon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Rodriguez.
Good afternoon, sir.
I, too, only have a few questions, and I'd like to focus them on 2 areas of your testimony today. The first is that the meeting that you've just told us about with Donald Gregg on August 8th. Just a couple of questions in that regard. First of all, prior to that meeting with Donald Gregg, you hadn't conducted any investigation yourself as to those areas you were concerned about, had you?
About?
Any investigation into any of the problem areas that you were bringing to his attention?
No, sir.
No. For example, with respect to Mr. Wilson, you had heard, and there's been some reference in the direct examination to Mr. Wilson and his involvement with Ollie North. Did you have any personal knowledge of Ollie North ever meeting with Mr. Wilson at any time?
No, I don't think that Colonel North was ever met with Mr. Wilson. It was just the other people that were involved with him that had a relationship with Mr. Wilson in the past.
So Wilson, as far as you know, was never involved in any way, shape, or form with the resupply effort?
Not at all.
Okay. And with regard to Mr. Klein's, as to your knowledge of Mr. Klein's involvement, did you have any personal dealings with Mr. Klein's as to this resupply effort?
No, sir.
Okay. Now,
I haven't even seen him during that time. I just heard of it, like what I told to the committee here.
Now, with regard to that meeting again with Donald Gregg on August 8th, did you present him on that occasion with any evidence in any tangible form, way, shape, or form?
No, sir.
Did you present him a copy of that letter that you had previously shown Mr. North, the Piawati letter, I believe you referred to it, Exhibit 8?
I don't recall if I did or I didn't.
Did you ask him to conduct an investigation?
No, sir, I did not.
Did you ask him to do anything?
No, sir. I just hope that this period will go by, pass, have the agency take over, and it will be better for everybody.
Now, did you point out to him, Mr. Rodriguez, that Ollie North, the September before, had recruited you to assist him in this effort?
Did I tell him?
Did you tell Mr. Gregg on that occasion, on
I
August 8th?
don't believe so, sir.
Why didn't you tell him that Ollie North had recruited you and you'd been working with Colonel North?
I didn't see any reason why to tell him. I really didn't.
He didn't ask you, did he?
No.
Now, turning to that June 25th meeting that you had with Mr. Dutton and with Mr. North, at the end of the meeting you testified that you pulled Colonel North aside and you had a little discussion with him alone, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And that lasted only a matter of minutes, didn't it?
Yes.
And it was during that conversation with him that you, for the first time, I believe your testimony has brought to his attention some of your concerns
That's
about
correct.
the situation down there,
That's correct.
even though you had had many opportunities on prior occasions to bring it to his attention.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And I also believe you testified that his response was to say that your concerns about Mr. Klein's weren't proper because, as far as he knew, Mr. Klein's was a patriot and was not acting improperly. Is that about right?
That's what he said, sir.
And so too with General Secord. Did he come up in that conversation?
No, I don't think so.
And your reaction to hearing that was to leave right on the spot, was it not?
Yes, sir.
Was it your impression, upon hearing Colonel North say that Colonel North had been duped or blinded by General Secord or any of the other people in that organization?
Could be, sir. I will not have any comment on that.
You didn't think
It
he
would
was...
be improper for me to try to speculate. I think that will have to come out in other way.
Did you think he was collaborating with them in any way to try to hurt the Contra cause or to harm the movement down there?
I just don't have I rather don't express a view on that. I really don't know.
You were concerned with regard to the best interests of the Contras, were you not?
Yes, sir.
And there was nothing that indicated to you that Colonel North wasn't interested in the best interests of the Contras as well, was there?
Can you repeat that again?
There wasn't anything that Colonel North said or did, was there, that gave you the impression that he too wasn't interested in the best interests of the Contras?
I didn't quite get your question, really.
Well, was it your impression that Colonel North, like you, was interested in the Contras' best interests?
Well, there's no question about it that the way he has supported in the past that he was interested in helping them.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the exhibits marked RCD 1 through 18 and FIR 1 through 5 will be made a part of the record. The committees stand in recess until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning in room 2172.
Hey, Jim. Can you kill 3? Power. I do it like this too, so I do 3 different ways. Because if I do it this part of my body, if I lean back, then I'm putting so it's kind of, it's hard, it's tough. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You get it, right? I'm trying to remember your position and try to lock the camera down.
There's only one thing wrong with this. Before it doesn't